Hello, and now we're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system. So just to remember, we had our central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and then you have your peripheral nervous system, your cranial nerves, your spinal nerves, and the peripheral nervous system has information coming in, sensory, and motor output going out. And this could either go out to the somatic nervous system, which is your skeletal muscle, or your autonomic nervous system. And autonomic, think automatic. So these are involuntary things. And so then we're going to do some more videos where we divide this further into sympathetic and parasympathetic. So we're going to talk about your autonomic or automatic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system, or your ANS, is divided into your sympathetic and parasympathetic, whereas sympathetic is fight or flight, parasympathetic is rest and digest. And we're going to go into details about that a little later on. And what the ANS does is you have motor neurons, that means output, efferents, that go to your smooth muscle and your cardiac muscle. So things like smooth muscle in your digestive system, cardiac muscle in your heart, and glands, things that produce stuff. And they help make adjustments to help ensure your optimal support for body activities. So homeostasis. So the ANS is really involved in a lot of things that help control your homeostasis. And all this is done at a subconscious level. You don't have to think about it. So in order to talk about the autonomic nervous system, we have to compare it to the somatic nervous system first before we do any more details. So the first thing is somatic is the nervous system that's voluntary. It's the one that goes out to the skeletal muscle. So the autonomic nervous system, this is the involuntary, and it's going to go out to your organs. And so in both cases, the cell bodies are going to be located in the central nervous system, and in both cases, they're going to send axons out to the peripheral nervous system. Okay. Now, we're going to talk about some differences between the parasympathetic and sympathetic, but right now I want to show you the differences between somatic and autonomic in terms of the neurotransmitters that they release. Okay, so in the somatic nervous system, it always releases acetylcholine. Acetylcholine always binds skeletal muscle, it always is stimulatory, always causes a contraction. In the autonomic nervous system, it can either have this branch or this branch in the sympathetic nervous system that produces norepinephrine, or it can be this branch in the parasympathetic division that releases acetylcholine. Now, norepinephrine and acetylcholine will then go out to their target organs and cause an effect. And these can either be stimulatory or inhibitory, depending on the neurotransmitter and what kind of receptor these organs have. And we'll talk about that in more detail later. But right now, from this slide, I want you to see that the somatic nervous system only uses acetylcholine. The parasympathetic nervous system uses acetylcholine and norepinephrine to bind to the effector to get a result somewhere in the body, either a muscle or a gland or an organ. Now, let's go and look at more detail on what's going on in the autonomic nervous system. So in the autonomic nervous system, again, you've got these two divisions, sympathetic, parasympathetic. In both, the cell bodies are in the central nervous system, okay? And they both have a post and preganglionic neurons. And so this is a ganglion, okay? So it's a little space where two neurons can come together and have their synapse. So in the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, this is the ganglion. And then in the sympathetic nervous system, when the first neuron synapses with the second neuron, it releases acetylcholine. Acetylcholine's excitatory, and it causes the next neuron to release norepinephrine. And you may have heard of this as noradrenaline, so that may help you think about what it does. So norepinephrine. Now in the parasympathetic nervous system, that first neuron goes to the ganglion, releases acetylcholine. It's still stimulatory, okay? That causes the second neuron to release acetylcholine, okay? So the sympathetic nervous system releases norepinephrine, the parasympathetic releases acetylcholine. And again, depending on what kind of receptor you have in the organs, it may or may not be excitatory or inhibitory. We'll talk about that as we move forward. Now there's one more thing that the sympathetic nervous system can do. that first neuron may synapse at the adrenal medulla or the adrenal gland. And when this does that, the acetylcholine is excitatory. It causes the adrenal gland to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. And then this neurotransmitter kind of acts like a hormone, and then it moves in from the blood to these organs and causes a response. So the sympathetic nervous system can act directly from neuron to neuron straight to the organ, or indirectly by causing the release of a norepinephrine into the blood, which then goes like a hormone to these organs. So this first one is really fast, and this one is a little bit, the second one's a little bit slower. So the second one allows the sympathetic nervous system to recruit extra help if needed. So if you imagine that you're trying to lift up a bus, maybe a bus is on your foot, and you're trying to lift up that bus, and you get that adrenaline rush. You may have heard of that before. And so that's this norepinephrine going out to try to increase your heart rate, get more blood to your muscles. But you need a little extra help. You need more adrenaline. So you would recruit your adrenal gland to submit and release more adrenaline or norepinephrine so that you could get your heart rate up and more blood to those muscles so that you would be stronger. So again, we're going to talk about this a little bit later. I just want you to notice that in these two, you have a two-chain setup with your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. Okay, so I've got this slide in here again because I wanted to kind of give a clean slate. When we talk about these neurotransmitters, that gives a name to the type of neuron that you're talking about, these fibers. And so these neurons that release acetylcholine are called cholinergic fibers. So the preganglionic neurons in the sympathetic nervous system here and here and here are all cholinergic fibers. They release acetylcholine, just like the nerve in the neuron in the somatic nervous system is cholinergic because it releases acetylcholine. Now, the neurons that release noradrenaline or norepinephrine are called adrenergic. Okay, so these adrenergic fibers release norepinephrine. So you have that second fiber in the sympathetic nervous system. You do not have it in the parasympathetic nervous system. In the parasympathetic nervous system, the second neuron is a cholinergic. So when you hear the terms cholinergic versus adrenergic, I just want you to know where those names come from. Because sometimes when you talk about different types of medicines, it will say it's an anticholinergic. And so you go, ooh, that means it does something against acetylcholine. Okay, so that gives you an idea of what those names actually mean. All right, so when we talk about those cholinergic fibers, those neurons that release acetylcholine, they have to go somewhere. So acetylcholine, remember here's your acetylcholine, it's got to go and bind some type of receptor. And there are two types of cholinergic receptors. So there's two different types of receptors that both bind acetylcholine. And they're named based on some drugs that also bind them or kind of mimic and bind those receptors as well. You have nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors. Okay, so the nicotinic receptors, those are the ones that are found on skeletal muscle and all the ganglionic neurons in the autonomic nervous system. So remember, you have that chain, you have that ganglion. So in the skeletal muscle and in those ganglionic neurons of the ANS, you have nicotinic receptors. Also, the ones that produce the hormone norepinephrine and epinephrine in the adrenal gland. When acetylcholine binds, it's always stimulatory. So nicotinic receptors, ACH binds, always stimulatory. In your muscarinics, these are going to be found on the target cells that are stimulated by those postganglionic, that second neuron. Okay, the second neurons that secrete ACH, and when ACH binds here, they can be stimulatory or inhibitory. So nicotinic and muscarinics are your two cholinergic receptors. And your adrenergic receptors, these are the ones that bind norepinephrine. And so when you talk about adrenergic receptors, you have alpha, and this is the little symbol for alpha, and they have alpha 1 and alpha 2, and then beta, and it's divided into beta 1, beta 2, beta 3. So if you've ever heard someone talk about a beta blocker, this is what we're talking about, okay? The receptors that bind norepinephrine. So if you have a beta blocker, you're doing something to block the receptor that binds the norepinephrine somewhere. So let's talk about a couple of these drugs and how you might use them and think about how they would affect how those receptors work. So atropine is a drug that we use during surgery, and it's an anticholinergic, okay? So anti-ACH. So you're trying to not let ACH bind. And so it blocks the muscarinic receptors, okay? And these muscarinic receptors, they're found in the salivary glands. And so you use you use atropine to help prevent salivation, because when someone's under, you don't want them salivating and aspirating. It also helps you to dilate the pupils. So sometimes you can use atropine to dilate pupils. So you want to use this to prevent them making too much spit during surgery, so that they don't aspirate while they're under anesthesia. Now, there's some over-the-counter drugs that you use for colds and allergies and nasal congestion. So think allergy season, fall and spring. And these are actually drugs that will stimulate the adrenergic receptor. So instead of blocking them, they actually stimulate. So the drug comes in and binds and causes them to fire. And that allows you to decrease your mucus production. And then another type of drug, your beta blockers. These are drugs that attach to those receptors, okay, and they cause your lungs, bronchioles, to dilate. And so if you're an asthmatic and you're having trouble breathing, you take a beta blocker and it opens up your bronchioles so you can breathe. It also slows your heart rate down. So people that have high blood pressure, a lot of times will take a beta blocker to slow their heart rate down, to lower their blood pressure. But you can take, for some people it makes you feel really bad because it makes your heart rate too slow and you kind of feel tired and sluggish.